At 27 years old, on July 23, 2011, Amy Winehouse was found dead, alone in her London home. No crowd, no stage, no applause, just silence where a voice that once won 5 Grammys in a single night should have been. So how does a woman who sold over 16 million records end up dying unheard in a locked room? The world sang along when she said, "They tried to make me go to rehab. I said no." But did anyone stop to ask whether that line was a joke, a cry for help, or a farewell disguised as a hit song? When Amy Winehouse walked onto the world's biggest stages, millions saw a superstar, but what they couldn't see was that every performance was already a negotiation with collapse. Because by the time she was winning awards, her body and mind were running on exhaustion, alcohol, and pain. So was the applause saving her or slowly finishing the job? In 2008, she stood under blinding lights and collected 5 Grammy Awards in a single night. Yet she wasn't even there in person. Stranded across the ocean, fragile and monitored, while the industry celebrated a voice that was already cracking behind the scenes. So how could the peak of her career arrive at the exact moment her life was slipping out of control? Night after night, videos surface of her forgetting lyrics, stumbling across stages, staring into crowds as if she didn't recognize where she was. And instead of stopping the shows, the machine kept rolling because tickets were sold, contracts were signed, and breakdowns made headlines. So when did public concern quietly turn into public entertainment? Her most famous song told the world she refused help, and the world laughed, sang along, and turned it into a slogan. But what if no wasn't a bellion at all? What if it was a voice of someone who had already given up on being saved? As her health deteriorated, photographers waited outside her home, critics listed her failures, and fans debated whether she was self-destructive or misunderstood. But no one asked the most dangerous question. What happens when a person becomes more valuable when they are hurt than when they are healed? Before the Grammys, before the chaos, before the world learned to romanticize her collapse. Amy Winehouse was just a painfully sensitive child growing up in North London, and the truth is, the seeds of everything that would later destroy her were already quietly taking root long before fame ever entered the picture. So was her downfall really sudden, or simply delayed? Amy was born into a Jewish family where music was not just entertainment, but tradition, memory, and identity, with jazz records constantly playing at home and legends like Frank Sinatra and Dinah Washington shaping her ears before pop radio ever did. Yet despite the sound-filled house, emotional stability was far less certain, because when her parents separated, something in Amy fractured early, leaving behind a deep fear of abandonment that would later define how desperately she loved and how badly she suffered when love disappeared. From a young age, Amy showed signs of extraordinary emotional depth, the kind that makes adults uncomfortable in children, because she didn't just feel sadness, she absorbed it, carried it, and turned it inward. And while teachers noticed her talent, they also noticed her volatility, her defiance, and her inability to conform. So instead of learning how to regulate her emotions, Amy learned something far more dangerous, that her intensity was both her gift and her problem. Music became her refuge, not as a dream of fame, but as a place to hide, a way to say the things she couldn't say out loud without feeling exposed. And while other kids learned how to cope through structure and support, Amy learned to survive by transforming pain into sound, which worked beautifully for her art, but catastrophically for her mental health. Because when music became the only place she felt safe, what happened when the world demanded that she perform that pain on command? By her early teens, Amy was already being described as too much, too honest, too sharp-tongued, too emotionally raw. And instead of being protected or guided, she was often dismissed as difficult, reinforcing the idea that love was conditional and stability temporary. So when she later clung to romantic relationships with almost destructive intensity, was that recklessness? Or was it the echo of a child still trying not to be left behind? Her early exposure to jazz also shaped her artistic identity in a way that would later isolate her from the mainstream industry, because she didn't want polish. She wanted truth, and she didn't want fantasy. She wanted confession, which meant that from the very beginning, Amy was building a career that required her to bleed in public. And if your success depends on reopening your wounds again and again, how long can any human survive before something breaks? Long before addiction entered the story, long before tabloids learned her name, Amy Winehouse was already living with an emotional intensity that demanded care, boundaries, and protection, but instead, it was mistaken for attitude, talent, or rebellion, And when the world later watched her unravel, the uncomfortable truth is that it wasn't witnessing the birth of a tragedy, but the final act of one that had been quietly forming since childhood. So if the foundation was already cracked, was fame ever going to save her? Or was it always going to finish what life had started? When Amy Winehouse stepped into the music industry, she didn't arrive chasing fame or trends, because from the beginning she made one thing clear: she would not become what the system expected her to be. And in an era obsessed with polished pop stars and manufactured perfection, how dangerous was it to be a young woman who refused to pretend? Record labels didn't know what to do with her at first, because Amy didn't fit neatly into any category. She wasn't pop enough for the charts, not rebellious enough to be marketed as edgy, and far too honest to be safely packaged. Yet the moment she opened her mouth to sing, it became obvious that she possessed something the industry couldn't teach: a voice that carried decades of soul, heartbreak, and lived emotion. So how do you sell an artist whose power comes from being uncontrollable? Her debut album didn't explode overnight, but it did something far more important. It announced the arrival of a songwriter who refused to lie, with lyrics that felt like overheard confessions rather than commercial hooks. And instead of escaping her pain, Amy leaned into it, turning failed relationships, insecurity, and emotional chaos into melody, which earned her respect from musicians but hesitation from executives. Because when your art is as raw, how do you protect the person behind it? While others were encouraged to soften their edges, Amy sharpened hers, rejecting ghostwriters, refusing to dilute her sound, and pulling from jazz, blues, and soul traditions that felt almost rebellious in a modern industry obsessed with youth and novelty. And this choice defined her identity early on, because she wasn't building a career designed to last safely. She was building one that told the truth at all costs. But if truth becomes your brand, what happens when your life starts falling apart? As her reputation grew, so did the tension between who she was and what the industry wanted. Because executives saw potential profit, while Amy saw a platform to express herself without filters. And this imbalance would later prove fatal, since one side was focused on numbers and deadlines, while the other was driven by emotion and impulse. So who was responsible for drawing the line when the artist herself didn't believe in limits? Amy's refusal to conform began attracting a cult following, people who didn't just like her music but felt understood by it, because she sang about shame, dependency, and longing without romanticizing them. And for listeners who felt invisible or broken, her voice felt like recognition. Yet with that connection came expectation, because the more people saw themselves in her pain, the more they demanded she keep producing it. So when authenticity becomes a service, does the artist ever get to heal? Behind the scenes, pressure mounted quickly, as managers pushed for a faster output, more touring, more exposure, while Amy's emotional world remained unstable and unprotected. And instead of slowing down to build resilience, she accelerated straight into the deep end of fame, because success arrived before she had learned how to survive it. So how does someone who never learned balance suddenly carry the weight of global attention? Her personal life began bleeding directly into her work, not as a calculated move, but as an emotional necessity, because writing songs was how Amy processed reality. And when her relationships grew volatile, the music followed, creating a cycle where heartbreak fueled art and art magnified heartbreak. And while audiences praised her honesty, few recognized the danger of a career that depended on emotional wounds staying open. So could this path ever lead anywhere but collapse? As offers multiplied and her profile rose, Amy became increasingly isolated, surrounded by professionals but rarely protected as a human being, because the system rewards output, not stability. And when warning signs appeared, missed rehearsals, emotional outbursts, self-destructive habits, they were often dismissed as part of the genius narrative, reinforcing the idea that suffering was not just acceptable but necessary for greatness. So when pain becomes profitable, who has the incentive to stop it? By choosing her own path, Amy secured creative freedom few artists ever achieve. But she also removed the guardrails that might have saved her, because there was no separation between the woman and the music, no safe space where she could fall apart without consequences. And while this authenticity would soon catapult her to extraordinary heights, it also guaranteed that every crack in her personal life would be broadcast, consumed, and monetized. So was her independence an act of courage, or the first irreversible step towards self-destruction? By the time her second album began to take shape, Amy Winehouse had already crossed a line few artists survive, becoming someone whose success depended entirely on emotional exposure, and with no filter between her inner world and the public eye. She was walking toward fame not as armor, but as a magnifying glass. And if the industry was about to turn her pain into a global spectacle, was anyone prepared to protect a person who had just made herself impossible to hide? When Back to Black was released, Amy Winehouse didn't just break through. She detonated. Because within months, her voice was everywhere, her image unmistakable, and her pain unmistakably profitable. And in a world desperate for something real, had the industry finally found artists could worship without fully understanding? The album didn't sound like its era, and that was precisely the point. Because while pop music chased perfection, Amy delivered confession, drawing from soul and jazz traditions that felt timeless, wounded, and intimate, and listeners responded instantly, not because the songs were polished, but because they felt honest in a way that bordered on uncomfortable. So when millions recognized their own heartbreak in her lyrics, did they realize they were celebrating someone who was still bleeding? Commercially, the success was undeniable, with Back to Black selling over 16 million copies worldwide, dominating charts, and reviving a sound many believe had no place in modern music. Yet behind the numbers was a woman being pulled in every direction at once, as fame arrived faster than structure, faster than support, faster than her ability to process what was happening. So, how do you prepare someone for global worship when they are still learning how to survive themselves? The night of the Grammy Awards cemented her legend, as she won 5 Grammys in a single evening, a rare and historic achievement. But the image most people remember is not triumph, it is absence, because Amy wasn't physically there, unable to travel, fragile and monitored, while the industry applauded from afar. And in that moment, the contradiction became impossible to ignore. How could the pinnacle of success coexist with such visible instability? With fame came icon status, her beehive hair, heavy eyeliner, and unapologetic attitude transforming her into a symbol, not just of music, but of rebellion, vulnerability, and authenticity. And soon she was no longer just an artist. She was an aesthetic, a brand, a cultural reference point. Yet icons are rarely allowed to rest, because once a person becomes a symbol, their humanity becomes inconvenient. So did anyone stop to ask what this transformation was costing her? Touring intensified the pressure, as packed venues demanded consistency from someone whose emotional state was anything but stable, and every performance became a test of endurance, with audiences cheering while insiders worried. Because some nights she was transcendent, channeling pain into brilliance, and other nights she was visibly struggling, fighting her own body and mind in front of thousands. So at what point does performance stop being art and start becoming exposure? The media amplified everything, turning her private life into a public narrative, tracking her relationships, her appearance, her weight, her behavior, and instead of focusing on the music, headlines fed on decline, because success stories are celebrated, but unraveling ones are consumed, and the more unstable she appeared, the more attention she received, creating a feedback loop where fame rewarded fragility. So when breakdowns generate clicks, who benefits from recovery? Despite the chaos, her artistic credibility only grew. As critics praised her songwriting, musicians cited her as an influence, and audiences treated her songs like emotional anthems. Yet the irony was brutal, because the very qualities that made her great, honesty, emotional openness, lack of pretense, also left her exposed, with no buffer between her inner turmoil and public consumption. So when the world applauded her courage, did they realize how little protection she had? Success brought wealth, recognition, and influence, but it also isolated her further, as trust became difficult and boundaries nearly impossible. Because everyone around her had a stake in her output, and when concern conflicted with profit, concern often lost, allowing warning signs to be reframed as quirks of genius rather than alarms. So when the system labels self-destruction as authenticity, how does an artist ever learn to stop? At the height of her fame, Amy stood as one of the most celebrated musicians of her generation, a symbol of raw talent triumphing over artificiality. Yet beneath the accolades was a person growing more exhausted, more scrutinized, and more alone, carrying the weight of expectation without the tools to manage it. And while the world believed she was living her dream, the truth was far more fragile, because the higher she rose, the further she drifted from anything resembling safety. So if this was glory, why did it feel so unsustainable? As Back to Black continued to define a generation, the gap between the legend and the woman widened. turning success into a spotlight that magnified every crack, and as applause drowned out concern, the question no one wanted to confront lingered beneath the celebration. When fame is built on emotional exposure, can anyone remain whole at the top, or does the peak always mark the beginning of the fall? At the height of her fame, Amy Winehouse was no longer just performing music. She was performing survival, because every appearance required her to stand upright inside a life that was quietly disintegrating. And while the world framed her behavior as scandal, the truth was far more uncomfortable. This was a rebellion, it was erosion. So how long can someone hold themselves together when everything around them rewards the cracks? The relationship that came to define her darkest years did not arrive as chaos, but as attachment, intense and consuming, filling the emotional vacuum she had carried since childhood. And at first it felt like grounding, like recognition, like finally being seen. Yet it quickly turned volatile, because when two unstable people cling to each other for identity, love becomes dependency. And dependency does not heal, it feeds on itself. So was this passion, or the beginning of mutual destruction. As the relationship intensified, so did the habits that followed it, with substances entering not as excess, but as anesthesia, a way to silence the anxiety, the pressure, and the constant surveillance. And while the public reduced her struggle to addiction, insiders knew it was something deeper, because Amy wasn't chasing pleasure. She was running from pain. And when numbness becomes a goal, how you convince someone to stop? Tour schedules continued despite visible decline, because contracts had been signed and expectations set. And instead of rest, she was pushed back onto stages she was no longer emotionally equipped to handle, turning performances into ordeals where audiences watched brilliance flicker through exhaustion, confusion, and despair. And each time she faltered, the footage spread faster than concern ever could. So, when did watching someone suffer become acceptable entertainment? Tabloids learned to monetize her deterioration with ruthless efficiency, tracking her movements, counting her weight loss, documenting her worst moments with the same enthusiasm they once reserved for her triumphs. And while criticism poured in under the guise of accountability, it rarely came with empathy, reinforcing the idea that public figures owe the world their composure regardless of the cost. So when did compassion become optional? Behind the headlines, warning signs multiplied, missed rehearsals, emotional breakdowns, canceled shows, hospital visits. Each one reframed as another chapter in the spectacle rather than a signal to stop, because the industry has a long history of mistaking crisis for mystique. And when self-destruction aligns with profit, intervention becomes inconvenient. So who is responsible for stepping in when the artist herself could no longer see the danger clearly? Amy's refusal to attend rehab became her most quoted line, repeated endlessly without context, stripped of nuance, and turned into a punchline. Yet those closest to her understood that resistance wasn't arrogance. It was fear, because admitting the need for help meant acknowledging vulnerability in a world that had already begun to feed on it. And when seeking treatment feels like surrender, how does anyone take that step? Isolation deepened as trust eroded, because every interaction felt transactional, every concern suspect, and the line between care and control blurred, leaving her increasingly alone even when surrounded. And without stable boundaries, substance use escalated from coping mechanism to compulsion, tightening its grip as external pressure mounted. So when the escape becomes a cage, where does one turn? Her body began to show what her voice had been carrying for years: fatigue, fragility, and physical decline that no amount of talent could conceal. Yet instead of slowing down, the machine accelerated, pushing for appearances, visibility, and content, because the myth of the tortured artist remained profitable, even as the artist herself deteriorated. So when suffering is reframed as authenticity, how does recovery survive? At this stage, Amy was trapped in a cycle that fed itself relentlessly. Pain led to numbing, numbing led to decline, decline fueled attention, attention increased pressure, and pressure intensified pain, creating a loop with no obvious exit. And while fans debated whether she needed discipline or freedom, the real issue went largely unaddressed. She needed protection, structure, and distance from the very spotlight that defined her success. But who was willing to dim the lights when the show was still selling out? As the signs grew impossible to ignore, it became clear that this was no longer a story about excess or choice, but about collapse happening in plain sight, one performance, one headline, one night at a time. And as the world continued to watch, the most dangerous illusion persisted, that there would always be time to stop, to intervene, to save her later. But when a person is breaking in real time, how many warnings does it take before later becomes too late? As the collapse accelerated, Amy Winehouse reached a point where recovery and destruction existed side by side, because there were moments when she seemed clearer, calmer, even hopeful, and then entire weeks where everything unraveled again, reminding those around her that healing is not a straight line, especially when the world keeps pulling you back toward the edge. So, how do you rebuild yourself when the environment that broke you never goes away? Attempts were made to regain control. Periods of sobriety, canceled appearances, brief retreats from public view, and each time she surfaced with fragile determination to start over, fans and media alike framed it as a comeback. But the pressure to prove stability often became another burden, because every small step forward was immediately measured, judged, and broadcast, turning recovery into a performance instead of a process. So when progress is constantly scrutinized, does it ever feel real? The stage, once a place of expression, became increasingly hostile, because stepping into the spotlight now meant confronting expectations she could no longer meet. And while some performances still carried flashes of brilliance, others revealed exhaustion so deep it bordered on disorientation, leaving audiences conflicted between admiration and concern. Yet instead of pulling back, shows continued, reinforcing the idea that as long as she could stand, she could perform. So at what point does endurance become exploitation? Physically, her body began to fail under the weight of sustained stress, substance use, and emotional strain, with visible signs of fragility that no amount of charisma could hide. And while rumors circulated about her health, concrete intervention remained inconsistent, because responsibility was diffused across managers, labels, promoters, and the artist herself, allowing everyone to believe someone else would step in. So when accountability is shared by everyone, does it belong to anyone? Public perception hardened as empathy eroded, with narratives shifting from concern fatigue, framing her struggles as repetitive, self-inflicted, or attention-seeking. And this shift proved devastating, because once compassion disappears, isolation deepens, leaving the individual trapped not only by their circumstances, but by the belief that they are no longer worth saving. So when society grows tired of someone's pain, what options remain? Behind closed doors, fear became constant. Fear of relapse, fear of disappointing others, fear of being abandoned if she could no longer perform. And instead of relief, moments of quiet amplified anxiety, making substances feel like the only reliable escape, even as they accelerated decline, creating a cruel paradox where the solution worsened the problem. And when fear dictates behavior, how does rational choice survive? Her creative output slowed as survival consumed her energy. And for someone whose identity was inseparable from making music, this loss cut deeply, reinforcing feelings of worthlessness and disconnection. Because if she couldn't write, couldn't perform, couldn't meet expectations, what value did she still hold in a system that had only ever praised her productivity? So what happens to an artist when they believe they exist only for what they can give? The final months were marked by an uneasy quiet, fewer appearances, fewer public incidents, and a sense that something fragile was being held together by sheer will. And while some interpret this as improvement, others recognize it as a calm that often precedes collapse, because withdrawal can look like stability from the outside, even as isolation deepens within. So how many warning signs did the silence itself contain? When the end came, it was not dramatic, not public, not surrounded by the spectacle that defined her last years, but alone in private, stripped of the noise that followed her everywhere else. And in that stillness lay the most painful truth of all. The world that had watched her unravel was no longer there to witness the final moment, leaving behind questions no headline could answer and regrets no tribute could erase. In the aftermath, debates erupted over blame, addiction, responsibility, and choice, but these arguments often missed the deeper reality, that this was not the story of someone who refused help, but of someone whose vulnerability became incompatible with a system built on consumption. And when a person's pain becomes content, recovery becomes inconvenient. So was her collapse inevitable, or simply enabled at every critical moment? As her life came to an end, the illusion that talent alone can protect a person finally shattered, exposing a truth the industry has long resisted acknowledging, that genius without care is not resilience, it is risk. And while her voice continues to echo, haunting and beautiful, the absence of the person behind it remains a warning written into history, asking a question that extends far beyond one life. How many more must fall before we learn that survival should matter more than spectacle. After years of collapse unfolding in public, Amy Winehouse reached a moment where survival itself became the goal, not triumph, not legacy, not even happiness, but simply staying alive long enough to feel like herself again. And when a person has lived inside constant chaos, how do they even recognize calm when it finally appears? There were signs, subtle and fragile, that something inside her was shifting. Moments when she spoke about wanting peace instead of applause, about needing distance rather than attention. And for the first time in years, the language she used wasn't about music or success, but about normalcy, about wanting to wake up without pressure, without expectation, without fear. So was this a beginning of change, or just another pause before the fall? She began pulling away from the relentless pace that had defined her rise, canceling shows, declining appearances, stepping out of the spotlight not as a statement, but as an act of self-preservation. And while critics framed this retreat as failure or avoidance, those close to her recognized it as something else entirely. Exhaustion so deep that continuing meant destruction. So when stepping back is the only way forward, why does the world call it weakness? Sobriety, or at least the attempt at it, became a central focus, not framed as redemption, but as necessity. Because for Amy, substances had never been about indulgence. They had been about survival. And removing them meant facing emotions that had been suppressed for years, raw and unfiltered. And while a moment of clarity brought hope, they also brought vulnerability, because without numbing, the pain returned sharper, louder, and more demanding. So how does someone learn to sit with feelings they've spent a lifetime running from? Creatively, she expressed a desire to reconnect with music in a different way, not as confession, not as catharsis of the world, but as something quieter, more controlled, less exposed, hinting at a version of artistry that didn't require self-destruction as fuel. Yet the industry struggled to understand this shift, because it had already built an image around her pain. And when an artist tries to change a narrative that made them famous, who allows them to do so? Public reaction to her withdrawal was mixed, with some fans rooting for her recovery, while others questioned whether she still mattered without constant output, revealing an uncomfortable truth about celebrity culture. Attention is conditional, and once productivity slows, concern often fades, leaving the individual alone to navigate recovery without the support they were promised. So how genuine is public love when it disappears the moment the show stops? Despite this, there were glimpses of something steadier. Interviews where she spoke with humor rather than defensiveness, appearances where she looked healthier, calmer, less frantic, and these moments fueled cautious optimism, because they suggested that beneath the damage, the person still existed, capable of reflection, capable of growth, capable of choosing life over spectacle. But optimism, when placed under a microscope, can become pressure, and pressure was the very thing she was trying to escape. So could hope itself become another burden? The idea of a comeback hovered constantly, not as her desire, but as an expectation imposed from outside, because in the entertainment world, recovery is rarely valued unless it leads back to production, and this tension placed her in an impossible position, where healing was acceptable only if it resulted in a return to the same system that had nearly destroyed her. So how does someone rebuild when the finish line leads back to the starting fire? In private, the struggle remained ongoing, marked by discipline, setbacks, self-doubt, and moments of fragile determination, because rebirth is not dramatic. It is repetitive, slow, and often invisible. And for someone whose entire life had been lived under observation, the invisibility of real progress felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable, yet necessary. So when the cameras turn away, does healing finally have room to exist? There was a sense in those final attempts to change that Amy was beginning to understand the cost of her past choices, not with shame, but with clarity, recognizing that survival would require boundaries she had never been taught to build. And while she lacked the time and structure to fully realize this transformation, the intention itself mattered, because it revealed that her story was not one of resignation, but of resistance, even if that resistance came late. So does trying still matter when the outcome remains uncertain? In this turning point, brief and incomplete as it was, Amy Winehouse showed something the public rarely acknowledged: a desire to live differently, to exist outside the role that consumed her. And while the attempt at rebirth never reached full form, it stood as proof that collapse does not erase agency, that even at the edge, the instinct to survive can still surface. And as she stepped tentatively toward a quieter life, the question lingered beneath the cautious hope: if the world had, allowed her the space to change. Would this fragile rebirth have had time to take root? After her death, Amy Winehouse did not fade quietly into memory, because the silence she left behind was too loud, too unresolved, and too revealing, forcing the world to confront not only what had been lost, but what it had participated in. So when the spectacle finally ended, what exactly were we left with? The immediate reaction was shock layered with guilt, as tributes poured in from fans, musicians, and institutions that had once benefited from her visibility, and suddenly the same behaviors that were mocked, criticized, or exploited were reframed as warning signs, creating a collective realization that arrived too late to change the outcome, because regret has a way of becoming loud only after responsibility has passed. So was this grief genuine, or was it simply the echo of missed chances? In the weeks and months that followed, her music surged back into charts, her albums re-entered public consciousness, and her voice once again filled spaces around the world. But now it carried a different weight, because listeners could no longer separate the beauty of the songs from the cost at which they were made, transforming her catalog into both art and evidence. And if her pain had fueled the work, did honoring the work also mean acknowledging that pain? Her influence became undeniable, shaping a new generation of artists who cited her honesty, vulnerability, and refusal to inform as permission to be imperfect, emotional, and real. Yet alongside inspiration came caution, because her story served as a reminder that authenticity without protection can be fatal, and that emotional openness, when commodified, requires safeguard the industry has historically failed to provide. So how do we celebrate influence without repeating conditions that destroyed its source? Public narratives began to shift, slowly reframing her not as a cautionary tale of excess, but as a complex individual caught in a system that rewarded output over well-being, and documentaries, retrospectives, and posthumous discussions attempted to reconstruct her story with nuance, emphasizing the lack of boundaries, support, and intervention that marked her career. But re-examination, no matter how thorough, cannot replace prevention. So what does accountability look like when the damage is already done? Her legacy also reignited conversations about mental health, addiction, and responsibility within creative industries, challenging the myth that suffering is a prerequisite for greatness, and exposing the ethical cost of romanticizing the tortured artist. Because when pain becomes part of brand, care becomes optional, and Amy's life stood as proof that talent does not immunize against harm. So how many more stories like hers are needed before systems change? Beyond industry debates, her music continued to connect with listeners on a deeply personal level, offering companionship to those who felt unseen, misunderstood, or overwhelmed by their own emotions. And in this way, her voice remained alive, not as spectacle, but as solace, reminding the world that what made her extraordinary was never chaos or controversy, but empathy. And if her songs still help others survive, does that transform loss into meaning or simply underline its tragedy? Time has softened some of the noise, but has not erased the questions her life left behind. Because legacy is not just about influence or numbers, it is about lessons, and Amy Winehouse's lesson remains unresolved, sitting uncomfortably between admiration and responsibility, asking whether the world is willing to learn from the cost of consuming someone's vulnerability as entertainment, or whether it will continue to cycle under new names and faces. So if her story still unsettles us, is that discomfort a sign of remembrance, or a warning we are still choosing to ignore? In the end, Amy Winehouse was not defeated by fame, addiction, or talent, but by the space between vulnerability and protection, a space the world never learned how to close. And when we look back at her story, the most uncomfortable truth is not how she lived, but how closely we watched as she struggled. She gave everything she had to her music, turning private pain into shared language. And in doing so, she made millions feel less alone. Yet that same openness left her exposed to a system that valued authenticity only as long as it produced results. And when the output slowed, support faded, revealing how conditional attention can be. So if empathy disappears when productivity stops, what does that say about the culture consuming it? Amy's legacy is not a warning about excess, but about neglect, about what happens when talent is celebrated without care and when suffering is mistaken for depth. Because genius does not require destruction to be meaningful, and creativity does not have to come to cost of survival. Yet her life suggests how easily the line between expression and exploitation can be crossed. Her voice remains raw and beautiful, echoing through time, but the absence of the person behind it carries equal weight, reminding us that behind every extraordinary artist is a human being who needs rest, safety, and understanding. And if her story still resonates, it is not because of how she fell, but because of what it asks of us now. The question Amy Winehouse leaves behind is simple and devastating. Will we continue to consume vulnerability as entertainment, or will we finally learn to protect the people brave enough to share it?